Welcome to Bible Q&A. My name is Mullet. Let's break this down, right? Got a few questions that have come to us today. One of them was posted in the chat room, and I forgot to cut and paste it. That's right. The question is, does the Bible contradict itself? That's the question. Now, that is quite an interesting question, actually. Does the Bible contradict itself? Why is it interesting? Because, you know, there are a lot of things in the Bible that do seem contradictory at times. You know, a classic example is right at the very beginning in Genesis, the creation account. Because if you read it, it describes creation happening, what seems to be, in two different ways. Yes, for reals. Because in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and it talks about the process and, you know, the order in which God created everything. But what then in Genesis chapter 2, it describes something almost completely different. It describes things in a different order. It describes God doing things at different times, and it doesn't even mention anything about days. What? Contradiction. There's a lot of this in the Bible. What you see is you see the Bible say one thing, and then usually pretty quickly it says something else. Then at the same time, you find this in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You see these are both history books about the history of the rulers of Israel and all the kings and all the events that happened surrounding their reigns. And there seem to be contradictions in there as well. And it's like, what is going on here? And what happens to a lot of people is they see these things and it kind of makes them wig out a little bit. And they start having a bit of a breakdown about, you know, the authority of the Bible and what this all means and what this is all about. Now, the answer is complicated, but you know what? You deserve a good answer. So I'm going to give it to you. Regarding, you know, Genesis chapter 1 and 2. What it comes down to a lot of the time, okay, is that the Bible, try and find a way to talk about this without anybody going crazy because it is a sensitive topic. What a lot of people usually like to just say is that there are no contradictions. And the truth is that there aren't any contradictions. But that's jumping over a whole lot of stuff to get there. The conclusion is correct. There are no contradictions, but that's kind of like somebody coming up to me and saying, hey, Mullet, I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana. How do I get to Los Angeles, California? And I look at them and I say, drive west until you're there. And then they go, okay, and they drive off. I'm skipping a lot of stuff. There's directions, there's highways, there's off-ramps and on-ramps and interchanges and toll roads. And I'm blowing over all of that and just saying, it's west, go. I didn't even point west just now, I pointed north. So really, it's that way. So what am I getting at? Mullet, that doesn't make any sense. Here's the deal. With Genesis 1 and 2, and with a lot of these other instances where things seem to contradict themselves, what happened a lot, not even a lot, what happened sometimes was that there were conflicting versions of the story. Now, this isn't hard to believe when you consider the fact that a lot of these things weren't necessarily written down right away. The Israelites and the Jewish people had a very oral-focused tradition. Now, indeed, you even see this with the Gospels, because the Gospels, it said, weren't written down until, you know, at least 5 to 10 years after Jesus had ascended back into heaven, and the church was already spreading. You know, as far as we know, no one was just following Jesus writing stuff down. He didn't have a whole bunch of reporters following him around. He didn't have people with iPhones whipping him out and recording his sermons. We got these Gospels that the apostles wrote down later on. Because what happened was it got to the point where the oral tradition wasn't enough. The message, the gospel, it needed to be spread, but it wasn't good enough for them to just spread it by preaching it. It had to be written down so that it could be copied, it could be shared, the letters could be sent all over the Roman Empire. So, sometimes we get that same thing happen, where it's just different versions of the same story, just like the Gospels. And sometimes it seems like the Gospels contradict each other. They say different things. But you know what? The Gospel writers, each apostle, they're their own person. And because of that, they had their own take on who Jesus was. They had their own personal experience with Jesus Christ. And because of that, it informed their views. And Luke, the Gospel of Luke, wasn't actually written by an apostle. It was written by another disciple who worked with the Apostle Paul. And it actually says in Luke chapter 1 that Luke had gone and interviewed all the eyewitnesses and wrote down the most accurate account that he could come up with. Every gospel writer had a different view, a different take. They saw Jesus in a bit of a different way, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about providing these different perspectives. And it's a wonderful thing, because we get to see different sides of Jesus. Don't think that we can pigeonhole Jesus. No way. That's why John wrote in his gospel that I'm sure that if everything that Jesus did was written down in books, it would be too much, and it would fill every library that existed in the world. Now granted, not a lot of libraries existed at the time as we know of them today, but that was a pretty heavy statement for that time. And it's definitely true that we haven't stopped talking about it or writing about it since then. Just about what we have. So, I don't know. Maybe in the long haul, it could have filled all the libraries. I don't know. But that's what a lot of the times these contradictions are. It's different versions of the same story. And you might say to yourself, well, why are these different versions of the same story put in there to begin with? Why not just have one gospel, Mullet? Why not just have one creation story in Genesis? Why do we have two versions of this story? Which one's right? Which one's wrong? They're both right. They're both emphasizing different things, though. For instance, in Genesis 1 and 2, we see the story of creation. You know, there's this idea of communicating an order to creation. It was done in a certain way, and God ordained it. And most importantly, God was involved at the ground level. Okay, God didn't just set a top spinning and then stand back and let it spin on its own. God is down there creating everything, and his fingerprints are all over everything. He's actively involved. And that's what we take away from Genesis 1, you know. And then, of course, talking about human beings, you know, making them in his image and everything else. And then we go into Genesis 2, which has a bit of a different focus. You know, it talks about how man was created first, and then God created everything all around humanity. It also grounds it in geographic locations. You know, it talks about rivers and countries like Ethiopia and the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, and then it talks about where the Garden of Eden was placed. And it emphasizes that creation wasn't just created by God and man was a part of creation, but it also emphasizes that it's a gift and that creation was created to be safeguarded by human beings as well. And in the same way, we see the exact same thing in the Gospels, you know. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus as the Messiah as predicted by Isaiah and other Old Testament prophets, coming in and doing exactly what he was prophesied to do. We see him as, you know, a king and the fulfillment of the Jewish prophecies. In Mark, we see Jesus as a servant of the people, and that he suffered for all of us as part of serving humanity. And then, of course, the Gospel of John shows us Jesus as God, and it emphasizes Jesus' deity and it talks in more detail about how and like how it worked. How was Jesus God and man at the same time? That's really a focus of the Gospel of John. All these points are valid. It's shared perspective. We get into this idea sometimes that the Bible has to say one thing because that's what's easy. And in a way, it's what we want. Because what we want is for God to come down and just tell us exactly the way it is. We want God to be able to just say, X plus Y equals Z, 1 plus 1 equals 2. The Gospel of Matthew is the correct gospel. You can ignore the other gospels. We want to do that because then it's easier to understand. It doesn't require as much thinking from us. And that's not to say that you're dumb or that you don't want to think about it, but it's to say that that's just the way our brains work, especially in the culture and the society that we've been raised in. With all the proof and the facts and the science and the technology surrounding us, we're very grounded in this idea that there is one right answer and one wrong answer, and we have to figure out the right answer so that we can know what the wrong answer is. But the Bible approaches the question differently. The Bible says, yes, there is one right answer, but you know what? There are different ways of looking at this right answer. There are different ways of viewing who Jesus was, just in the same way that there are different ways to view how creation came to be. And at these key points in the Bible, we see these different views emerging. And what it suggests is that the Bible, and specifically the people who wrote it, want all of us to remember that it is okay for us to disagree sometimes, but moreover, that there is always a different way of looking at things. And that we have to learn how to appreciate that and value that for what it is. So, really, that's my answer on that. Scripture-wise, I kind of took big chunks, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. There's a lot of other famous contradictions in the Bible, but they all come down to that in some way or another. Now, this wasn't the full directions to Los Angeles, okay? I left out a lot of details. I mostly did that just to keep it at a place where we can all understand each other. If you want to find out the exact details, you can go ahead and email me at clint@remedylive.com. I'll talk to you about it. But aside from that, I think that's where I'll leave it. Anyway, this has been Bible Q&A, and it was a great question. It's a good question. I love that question. I'll answer follow-up questions after we play some more music. Everyday Sunday is on now with Calculate right here on Remedy Live. We chat, we listen, and we love.